Welcome to the Writer Reads The Strays of Lunar One. This is Book 2, The Unwanted, Chapter 9, Ravelin Boards. Oliver woke to darkness and the dull boom of footsteps passing close by. He strained to hear voices, but couldn't. The boom came again, and he gasped. This time the tank responded. Lights in the base brought his surroundings to soft-lit life, and a small screen came to life in front of him. He frowned. Hadn't the sides of the tank been glass when he'd last looked? They had, but now he was enclosed in solid metal. And then he remembered what Paulie had said. If we're boarded, we have metal covers to cover the outside, and they look just like the other chem tanks. If we're boarded, he muttered, and pressed his lips together. Last he'd looked, these things had speakers built in which carried speech to the outside, and if what he was seeing on the screen was any indication, he really didn't want that to happen. The dull booms he'd heard had indeed been footsteps, and they belonged to a half-dozen men currently working their way through the biospace. He remembered what the crew had said about the biospace being somewhere most folk avoided, and curled his lip. He guessed they hadn't come across too many of the fine people from Ravelin then, because those bastards didn't avoid anywhere they thought their prey might be hiding. He watched the blood-red uniforms searching the space in front of the tank. When they left that area, he wondered if there was a way to follow their progress through the ship, because he needed to know they hadn't found Lewis. Tank or no tank, Oliver had no intention of letting that happen. "And what exactly are you going to do about it, Ollie boy?" he asked himself, feeling the firm grip of the restraints built into the frame. Given they hadn't responded when he'd spoken before, Oliver figured he'd see if the screen would respond to a voice command. This would be easier if I had access to the ship's net, he thought. I could just use my implant then. The thought stopped him before he could speak, and he groaned. I am 10 times the idiot, he muttered, realizing he hadn't even tried accessing the ship. Closing his eyes, he let his conscience sink into his implant. Sure enough, he was connected to the ship's net, and his message bank was flashing an alert. Well, he could guess what that was about. Oliver frowned at it, tempted to ignore it. In the end, he opened the message bank and checked the message IDs and names. The first unopened one was from one Candela Michaels, MD. The second had entered the system a half-hour later, and his security programs had promptly fenced it off. Nice try, arseholes, he murmured, and set himself a reminder to have Lewis take a look at it when there was somewhere they could download and isolate it. Until then, he'd have to leave it where it was and try not to click on it by mistake. Ravelin hired good people, where it didn't try coercing them into working for them. They were going to have to be extra careful about that message, which still didn't mean that Doc's message was kosher. Oliver figured he'd open that later and moved carefully from his head and into the ship's systems. While this was usually Lewis's domain, it didn't mean he was totally clueless when it came to doing what he needed. And the freighter was an older model. He knew this layout. It didn't take him long to find their surveillance cams, or to identify the search programs Ravelin's techs had put into the system to try and identify where he and Lewis might be hiding, because Ravelin was sure they were aboard. Oliver wondered which of the Crawshell's crew had flipped, or which of the crew from Booster's Squire. It didn't matter. Ravelin was searching the Squire from top to tail as a quick flip through the surveillance scans showed. Trying to figure out what to do next, Oliver switched to external scans. What he saw made his heart sink. Ravelin hadn't sent a little boat, but since when did the company have access to the same kind of firepower Odyssey could call on? Pushing that thought aside, Oliver looked for the boat that had carried the boarding party. He figured the battle cruiser standing off the Squire's port bow could have force-docked, and that if it hadn't, then the Squire's captain had seen the writing on the wall and let them send a... The surveillance cameras brought up a single flight bay and showed the squat bulk of a dropship nestled in its center. The hangar bay doors were closed, and half a dozen technicians had been lined up against the hangar bay wall. They stood with their hands raised. Oliver didn't recognize any of them, and he wondered how long it would be before the squad aboard the Squire found someone who knew who'd been brought aboard. Stupid, he muttered. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Because when he shifted through the cams to the bridge, he recognized the big blonde pacing the deck and staring intently into the mind of every crewman lined up along the forward view screen. We know you took them aboard, the sigh rumbled, and several of the crew whimpered. The big man's gaze raked across them. What I don't understand is why none of you have any recollection of the event. Except you. He pivoted toward the captain, and she shrugged. I accepted the contract, but the client changed their mind and organized a pickup shortly out of the Shard. The Psy stalked over to her and pressed his head against hers. And I can't read your mind to see if you are telling the truth. Oliver gave a choked laugh. Oh, well, now he understood the Psy's frustration. While most humans were vulnerable to that kind of mental invasion, there were a very few, who were so psionically dead that a Psy couldn't penetrate their minds and read them. That the one person who'd controlled the bartering with nettles was a psionic dead zone was hilarious, but Oliver frowned. That Psy could sense them over miles. Why wasn't he sensing them now? And how hadn't he sensed which crew members had brought them aboard and interrogated them? And what about the doc? How had he not found her? Putting those questions aside, Oliver dove into the system, working his way carefully through the security sections to see if Ravelin had penetrated them. The answer was not all of them, but he decided it would be better if no one emerged from hiding until the programs had been purged, and that meant he needed Lewis, and to contact the doc, the captain, and the rest of the crew they'd hidden. His only problem was how to do that without Ravelin discovering where they were. Oliver split the screen into 6, each one showing Ravelin's people combing through the hidden spaces of the booster's squire. They weren't finding them all, he noted, watching as one of Ravelin's team scanned a strip of wall in the engine room and somehow didn't find the hidden compartment behind it. Oliver wondered how the ship managed that, but given the compartment contained a dozen racked stasis pods, all with their monitors active, he didn't care. Stasis pods or VR pods, he wondered, given long haulers tended to have both. But identifying the pods in the system and gaining access to them were two different things. Now he really needed Lewis. He only hoped that contacting Lewis wouldn't be as hard. His beta was as locked down as he was, or as any of the pods for that matter. Oliver tried his beta's implant, but Lewis was out to it, and Oliver couldn't work out how to wake him up without beginning the exit process. And that was something he definitely didn't want to do. At a loss for what he could do to warn the crew of their compromise, Oliver settled back in the rack and tried to figure out what to do next. At the same time, he kept part of his attention on the Ravelin's battle cruiser stationed off their port bow and tried to monitor the booster's scans. He watched as Ravelin took the ship apart, not literally, although their search was thorough. He also watched while the Ravelin Psy rummaged through all the minds he could reach, saw the captain clench her fists, and wondered when the Psy would get the bright idea of torturing her crew until she talked. He didn't, and Oliver could only put it down to the fact that none of the crew he had available had any memory of him and Lewis being loaded onto the ship. As he thought that, he remembered how empty the ship's corridors had been when they boarded, and now he had an inkling why. It looked like the Crawshell's crew knew their business after all. He returned his attention to the Psy, watching as he finished studying the minds of the command crew. When he was done, the Psy left a guard on the bridge, taking a small escort with him as he walked the ship. From the concentration on his face, the Psy was searching for something. More minds? Oliver wondered, since the Ravelin teams had made a pretty thorough search for the physical. Even so, Oliver was sure bodies would follow if the man discovered where the crew had stashed him and his beta. He tensed as the Psy walked through the engine room, moving not far from the hidden compartment where the doc and her team were in stasis. He saw when the big man winced at something he couldn't hear. The Psy paused, his brow furrowing as his eyes narrowed in pain. "What's wrong with your drive?" he demanded of one of the engineers, and Oliver saw the man's eyes widen. "Nothing," he replied, and the Psy bent down and leant his forehead against the crewman's. "Nothing," he growled, and the man gulped. "No, sir, it's always made that sound. We've been over it, but that's the way it's meant to be." Given what he'd been told when he'd arrived, Oliver knew that was the truth, and the Psy could obviously read enough of the crewman's mind to ratify it. He stepped back from the man, gritting his teeth as he did so. "Next," he ordered, and his escort took him through the rest of the engine room and then brought him to the life support section. The Psy wrinkled his nose, and Oliver couldn't blame him. Someone, and he didn't know who, had created a leak. It wasn't dangerous, but it was well placed, and the entire area would need a thorough cleaning to get rid of the stench. The expressions on the team members' faces told him just how bad it was. Damn civilians. Can't even keep their bio in good order. Oliver watched the Psy. While he had faith the tank's external casing was proof against scans, he wasn't so sure about Psy. Had the booster's crew thought of that? From the pace the Psy took as they moved through the section, it looked like the man sensed something. But he didn't stop, and he didn't give the tanks a second glance. Oliver waited. While he might not know what sort of shifter the man was, he did know one thing. The Psy was a hunter. It was evident in the way he moved, and the shift of his eyes as he scanned his surroundings. A big cat, maybe? But whatever it wasn't any kind of cat Oliver knew. He didn't relax until the Psy left the bio section, taking the team with him. And even then, he didn't relax until an alarm squawked through the comms. "Sir, we have incoming." Who? Interesting, Oliver thought. Not where or when, but who? The answer wasn't comforting. "Odyssey, sir." The Psy cocked his head. "Ship type?" "Cruise liner." There was a pause and the sound of rapidly tapped keys. "The Sugar Side, sir." However silly the name sounded, it obviously meant something to the Psy. "It's time to go," he decided. "Now. Leave everything and everyone intact." Everyone? Oliver wondered, suppressing a shiver. Now why would he have to specify that? He realized he'd been focusing so hard on the Psy and his team that he'd lost touch with the external scans, and he was too scared to go find it. Not yet. Not with the Psy's words still echoing in his ears, and Ravelin still on the ship. He watched them converge on the dropship and held his breath until they let the ground crew clear the hangar before opening the hangar bay doors. Even then, he didn't relax until he'd run through every surveillance camera and made sure the ship was clear. Once the dropship had launched, he returned his attention to the external sensors. Ravelin's people had put traces on those. Again, wishing Lewis was available, Oliver carefully worked his way around them and studied the feeds. Ravelin's cruiser stood off long enough to collect its shuttle, and then it stood off a little longer. The programs they'd left in the Squire's system flashed, sending reports, and a heartbeat later, the cruiser's engines flared and she started moving away. Oliver tensed. This was the part where the pirates blew their unsuspecting target to dust and left the wreckage for others to wonder over. If Ravelin did that, he could only hope Odyssey's presence would be enough to deter them. Although why a battlecruiser was running from a luxury liner, he didn't know. It was yet another mystery he and Lewis were going to have to look into. He watched the cruiser's engines brighten, noting when the Squire's sensors remained dormant. Not a single weapons alert brightened the consoles in the command section, or called the warning systems to action. Still holding his breath, Oliver watched as the cruiser picked up speed, moving toward the warp point for Gertak's shard. He waited for the case surrounding the tank to open, but it didn't. The captain's voice rolling into his implant made him gasp. "So, did you enjoy the show?" she asked. That, at least, he could answer honestly. "No, ma'am, I did not." "And my systems?" she demanded, making him wonder how she knew. "Compromised." "Can you clear them?" "I need Lewis for that. What Ravelin put in is outside my skill set." "You're the muscle, huh?" she concluded. Her tone was only slightly mocking, and Oliver pushed down the urge to correct her. The fact was, he was the muscle, or mostly the muscle. "You could say that," he replied, and she chuckled. "I'll get Doc to bring him up to speed," she said, and Oliver interrupted before she could act on that decision. "Can she do it remotely?" On screen, the captain paused. "Remotely? Your surveillance systems are compromised, he explained. It's one of the things I can't untangle, and I couldn't tap the pods to warn them. The captain looked satisfied with that. At least some of my systems held, she replied, and Oliver gave her a sour look. She must have had some visual on the tank, because she laughed. We transport all sorts, Mr. Landstrom, and we hire the best for security. Oliver nodded. Speaking of which, are you? Am I what? Hiring us. She gave the camera a calculating look. Credits or an exchange? What did you have in mind? He wanted to know. Well, for a start, the doc says you could do with more tank time than you can afford, and your equipment is basic at best. Oliver nodded. I'll send you a fee schedule and let you make an offer. She smiled. Before or after we put you to work? That made him pause, but the choice was obvious. After, he told her, the ship's security is my security. But I might not trade fairly, she pushed, and Oliver sighed. I'm hoping you will. It's your ship, and you haven't betrayed us so far. And with Ravelin's people on board, she'd had a prime opportunity to do so. What she'd do if Odyssey decided they wanted to intrude, he didn't like to think. She inclined her head. Then I think we can do business, Mr. Landstrom. He was about to reply when she added, and I won't be handing you over to Odyssey either, not without considerable duress. And as we haven't done anything to ping their radar. Oliver relaxed. That was something. But it only made him wonder what she'd have done if he'd insisted on payment first, and if it wouldn't be better to turn themselves in. Oliver closed his eyes. Let me know when Lewis is online. We'll do a thorough walkthrough of your systems and take out any hooks, connections, or time bombs Ravelin might have left behind. And you'll make sure they can't do it again? She asked. Nothing can guarantee that, he replied. Not if they get direct access to your terminals. But we can make an assessment and let you know what, if anything, can be done to stop them repeating the same intrusions. That seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded. Agreed. We'll talk shortly.